welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. Election Day 2020 has come and gone. Joe Biden is then projected as the president-elect, but there are still questions out there. Here to talk about what happened on November 3rd over the past few days and possibly what could happen next is Dr. Melissa K. Miller, professor in the Department of Political Science at Bowling Green State University. Welcome again, Dr. Miller, to the Journal.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we know that on November 3rd, the election was held. The counting in some cases may or may not still be continuing as we speak now because we're a few days out from the election. But let's talk a little bit first about the state of Ohio, because when we've talked before, Ohio has been a bellwether for presidential elections for the most part, with an occasional exception. This year, obviously, as it stands right now, Ohio would not have been the presidential predictor it typically is. So talk a little bit about how that may have happened, why this year could be an outlier, or is this a new trend for the state to be more red than blue?
Well, I think you're exactly right about the status of Ohio being somewhat in question. We've always been the best bellwether of all 50 states in terms of picking the winner. Assuming that the results hold with Biden taking the oath of office on January 20th, which I expect will happen. We need to see the Trump legal challenges play out through court. But assuming that Trump is elected president and takes the oath of office in January, then Ohio just blew its long-standing record. The last time Ohio voted for the candidate who did not win was 1960.
Wow.
Every election that after that, all the way up until Tuesday, Ohio had picked the winner of the White House. And so there had been questions coming into the election about whether Ohio should be considered a red state. And the reason for that was that President Trump won Ohio in 2016 by 8 points. That was a really big margin and pretty out of step with the national popular vote, which Trump actually lost by 3 million votes. I thought what was interesting on Tuesday night when Ohio got called was that Donald Trump won again by about 8 points. So it showed sort of a very consistent pattern that is likely to be replicated, I would have to say. It does appear that Ohio now is much more of a red state and is moving out of that battleground state status.
Well, and again, too, similar to 2016, I believe the race in Ohio was supposed to be extremely close. I mean, it was supposed to be very much almost a toss-up, or if ever so slightly leaning toward Donald Trump. But as you just said, it didn't end up like that.
It didn't, and that is one of my big concerns, sort of as a researcher, as a scholar, is that the polling once again seemed to be pretty off what the final outcome appears to be, particularly in Ohio. Let's set aside the overall presidential election and just look at Ohio.
Right.
The Ohio race, if you looked at the poll of polls, for instance, at Real Clear Politics, showed basically a toss-up. All right. So in the past several weeks, you'd seen Joe Biden ahead by 2-3 points, and then Trump ahead by 3-4 points, but nothing was predicting an 8-point Trump victory, which is well outside the margin of error for any poll. I've said in this venue before and in other venues that polling for election prediction purposes is so very difficult. And one of the reasons is that pollsters have to try to compile a sample of voters who will actually vote that will be representative of the final composition of the electorate, which nobody knows until after the election is over. So it's very difficult for pollsters to judge, do I have the appropriate mix of Republicans versus Democrats, of rural dwellers and urban dwellers and suburban dwellers? Those are very difficult. And I honestly just think that pollsters do not yet have the forecasting models of turnout that are essential to get the pre-election polls adjusted in such a way that you get a good reflection of the actual electorate. And I think that's the biggest challenge going forward for the polling industry.
Yeah, and I guess, and it's interesting too, because it almost seems as if too it's a factor of, do you have the right sample of people? But then now too, throw in the fact too that this year you had a lot of people, more than we've ever typically dealt with, either early voting or voting by mail, in essence, in some form or fashion, voting ahead of that day, and yet turnout on election day was still pretty high. So that was another sort of a monkey wrench into the gears, kind of, because nobody anticipated, I think, the turnout numbers either that we got. At least I believe
And
that's
even
the case.
I had said, every time we have a big important election come along, and every 4 years we say this is the big important election, the most important election, right? And turnout only goes up just a little bit. Well, this time it really did, break records. So Joe Biden has won more votes than any other candidate for president in history. And second in line with the second highest vote tally is Donald Trump. So that tells you all you need to know about turnout. And I actually think that's one of the really interesting and kind of promising things about this election. The fact that Americans were so deeply engaged and turnout was at such a high level, that is good for democracy. It's good for the legitimacy of democratic institutions that so many people voted.
Right. And I know that I voted typically during the day in terms of the time of day, later than I normally do. Usually I vote like first thing, in line at 6:30, whatever. And I specifically wanted to vote on election day just to see what was going on. But I voted later at a time when typically in the precinct I'm in, which is a rural precinct, it's pretty quiet. The poll workers are like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do for the next 3 hours, kind of a thing. Not that they don't have things to do, but it's a lull time typically. And when I pulled in, the parking lot was full and there was a line at that time. And there typically has never been anything like that. So there were a lot of people that day showing up, not before work, not after work, but during the middle part of the day, which was kind of surprising. But I guess, as you just said, it was a signpost that, yes, we were going to set records for voter turnout in terms of the gross numbers involved.
Absolutely. And I've heard anecdotal reports of high turnout and long lines elsewhere around Ohio and in other parts of the country as well. So that's always, frankly, good for democracy in the sense that democratic institutions face issues of sort of credibility when, you have folks who are elected to public office with low turnout. And so that's not going to be the case here. The issue here has more to do with the millions, over 65 million Americans voted by mail. And that in itself is just record breaking and also totally understandable in the sense that a global pandemic is raging and frankly getting worse as we get, further into the fall months. And so over 65 million Americans decided to vote by mail. And what that meant was that it took a lot longer to count the votes. Now, that wasn't true in Ohio. Because under Ohio law, the mailed-in ballots could begin to be processed before the election and could begin to be tabulated before the election, even though under Ohio law, no results could be released. That counting of mail-in ballots was already well underway, which is why on election night in Ohio, the results in Ohio was called fairly early because come election day, the only votes that had to be added were those in-person votes cast on election day at electronic voting machines that get tabulated right away. So Ohio was called early. What I found fascinating was that the process was reversed in some key states. States like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, let's focus actually just on Pennsylvania, where under state law, they couldn't count early. And so they counted the same day ballots first. That had Trump way ahead. Then when they started counting the mailed-in ballots, his lead shrunk and eventually disappeared.
Well, when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about the fact that, the states all have different rules, which again, not all of us have been aware of. So we come back, we'll talk a little more about election 2020 with Dr. Melissa K. Miller here on The Journal. Thank you for staying with us here on The Journal. We're talking with Dr. Melissa Miller from Bowling Green State University about the election. And as we ended that last segment, we talked about the fact that there were huge numbers of people that voted early, voted by mail in essence in one form or another, not just here in Ohio, but across the country in all the different states. And the fact that not every state handles those ballots, as you referenced the difference between Ohio and Pennsylvania, and that led to some interesting numbers showing up in different states at different times. So talk about the fact too that the states all have different rules when it comes to collecting these ballots, tabulating these ballots, counting them, and then dispersing the actual count.
Yes, and frankly, that's the way the founders set up the system. All right.
Okay.
So our nation's founders left the administration of federal elections to the individual states. At that time, there were only 13 states. Now we have 50. So you can imagine the different permutations of various deadlines to request an absentee ballot, to get that absentee ballot postmarked, to get that absentee ballot received. So I worry the upside to that kind of system is it's very difficult then for there to be widespread fraud, right? Because how do you do that across enough states to change an election outcome when every state has different laws? The downside is some voter confusion. And also I would say that I think passions were high on both sides in this campaign. Both sides felt that the stakes were extremely high in this election, and both sides had a set of very passionate reporters. I meant to say supporters. And so that makes it difficult to see a process that takes 4 or 5 days, to see a process where perhaps your favored candidate seems to be leading in a state, but once the mail-in ballots are counted, that lead shrinks and even disappears in some cases. Pennsylvania is a good example of that. So I think it's been challenging for folks to wrap their heads around. And it should be noted that the president is filing a number of lawsuits in various states, trying to challenge the results of the election. And we'll see how those lawsuits make their way through the courts and whether they change the outcome in any individual state. I would say it is going to be a big lift to change the final outcome, because it would involve the Trump team being successful through litigation in changing outcomes in not just one state like Florida in 2000, but in a handful of states.
All right. And as you mentioned too, and Ohio was, as you said, the reverse of Pennsylvania. Here in Ohio, the mail-in votes were tabulated and put into the system as being, here are the votes that came in right away first, whereas in Pennsylvania, those mail-ins were tabulated after Election Day or as Election Day was going on. So in Ohio, Biden led early, lost late. In Pennsylvania, the exact opposite happened, which, as you said, unfortunately leads people to think something scurrilous has happened. Wait a minute, I was way ahead, now I'm behind. What's going on? I thought I had won this, no, I didn't. And as you said, for voters and supporters, yeah, a little disconcerting, because they're thinking, wow, we're doing really well. And then suddenly, but the other thing was too, that was explained a lot. I think all of the networks, all of the pundits, all of those folks were saying, look, what you see initially may not be what you get in the end, but that's easy to say, not easy to accept sometimes. So
exactly.
that's
and again, it's the pandemic. We don't normally see over 65 million Americans vote by mail. It just, it doesn't happen. Because people like the experience of voting. They like to go. I mean, there is evidence in some of the scholarship on voting and voter turnout that folks like to feel part of their community, part of something special by literally showing up in person. So I don't think that this voting by mail is going to be some sort of permanent fixture at this level in American elections. I think it will be more common than it was in the past, because there will be folks who got comfortable with it. But I don't think we're going to be seeing presidential elections where we get upwards of 65 to 70 million voting by mail in the future. I think that will have been sort of an anomaly that can be traced right to the coronavirus pandemic.
Okay, because to some degree there is a convenience in voting by mail for the most part, which, you know, we've always talked about. How can we make this easier for people to cast their ballot? What are the ways to make it simpler, faster, less invasive? Although then the other argument is, well, it shouldn't be a simple thing. You should have to put some effort forward, but that's another argument for another day, I guess, too.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting, and there will be scholarship on this in the months and years to come, but that there was this conventional wisdom that a high turnout election would favor Democrats. And we've talked about this before, Steve. Now, one of the things that's interesting is it does appear short of any changes in that would happen through the court actions that the Trump campaign is seeking, that Joe Biden did win the presidency.
Mhm.
But what's noteworthy is that turnout seemed to increase among both Biden and Trump supporters.
Right.
So Donald Trump won more votes in 2020 than he had in 2016. His turnout went up and Joe Biden's turnout went up. The result ended up favoring the Democratic nominee in this case, but I'll be interesting to see those studies about, was this just that turnout favors, a Democrat in all instances, or were there factors about this election? I mean, I do think that the coronavirus pandemic was on the ballot in a sense,
Hmm.
that Donald Trump was running against both Joe Biden and the pandemic. And it made it very, very difficult for the incumbent to win when there are such grave statistics now about the loss of life under the pandemic. And I think the fact that Joe Biden, I think he was sort of the man for the moment. When you think about the other Democratic candidates he ran against in the primary, he was the one who had 8 years as vice president, 8 years in an executive position with some direct experience dealing with global viral outbreaks and that sort of thing. And I think once the pandemic hit, his momentum in the Democratic primary really picked up because voters began to prioritize that executive experience that Biden had. And he carried that through all the way to the general election. So there really are a host of factors that contributed to Biden doing so well on election day and in the days that followed as the vote was counted.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that too, because Joe Biden, in essence, at the beginning of the Democratic nomination process, looked like he was done after Iowa and New Hampshire. I mean, he rolled into South Carolina, basically gave up on New Hampshire, it looked like, and then said, I'm going to South Carolina. And that was a make or break thing. Once he was successful there, and maybe it was a matter of the timing, all of those things you talked about too, but that's where he started to become a successful candidate for the nomination. It wasn't looking too good until then, and it was a combination of things, obviously, that got him the nomination then. So
yes, and honestly, Steve, you're absolutely right. And I mean, think about it. He placed 4th in the Iowa Democratic caucus. He placed 5th in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. Most candidates, they exit the race with results like that. But Joe Biden promised that once his campaign got to South Carolina, his fortunes were changed. Would change. And boy, was he right. He knew that his support was deep and strong within the African American community, and that it would take getting votes counted in a Democratic primary in a state that had a concentration of African American voters in a way that Iowa and New Hampshire don't. They are predominantly white states. So he knew that he stood a much better chance in South Carolina. And then on the eve of the South Carolina primary, for Congressman Jim Clyburn, the highest ranking African American elected official in the country, who's in the House leadership, for him to endorse Joe Biden was, I think, a pivotal moment in the campaign. And the momentum that he was able to build on then, as the campaign then moved to a number of other states in the Midwest, in the far West, in the South, that he could build on that momentum. And many of those states did have sizable Black populations. And again, his 8 years as President Barack Obama's sort of chief lieutenant, as his vice president, I think really helped. And in that position, he had fostered such deep ties within the Black community and amongst local Black elected officials in various states that also helped him as those endorsements started to come in. So I wasn't surprised, frankly, when he named Kamala Harris to be his vice president, because she kind of fit the bill for so many reasons. And I think the fact that she is a Black American was part of it, that he knew he owed a debt to the Black community to even get the nomination.
Well, and when we come back, let's talk a little about that, because there was history. This was a historical election in terms of a number of different things, but that's one that we haven't touched on yet, is the fact that we have a woman of color as the vice president projected. of the United States. So back in just a minute with Dr. Melissa K. Miller here on The Journal. You're with us here on The Journal on WBGU-PBS, and our guest is Dr. Melissa K. Miller, professor in the Department of Political Science at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Miller, with that last segment, we were talking about the fact that you have, projected elected President Joe Biden and a projected Vice President, obviously Kamala Harris, which we've talked about historic turnouts, we've talked about historic mail-in vote numbers, but we also have in the case, should the election hold as it is, as we're sitting here today, the first woman of color, the first woman vice president and the first woman of color to be projected as the vice president. So talk a little bit about what that role might have played in the election too on the Democratic side.
Yes, as I said at the close of the last segment, I was not so surprised when he picked a woman of color. There was pressure for him to do so, but I don't think that he was at all pressured into doing it. I think that presidents always pick a nominee who will do one thing for them, and that's help them win the election. That is always the number one factor. I would say it's even more important to the candidate to pick someone who can help them win the nomination than it is to pick someone who is absolutely ready to step in should something happen, right?
Right.
And so the fact that African American voters were so central to Joe Biden's victory in winning the nomination, the fact that he had been vice president to America's first Black president, and also I think there's been a real acknowledgement, not just by the Biden campaign, but among journalists and the broader public, that Black women have played a really important and often unsung role in so many important movements, whether that's the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, whether that's the Black Lives Matter movement. It is often because of the really hard work done at the grassroots level and the get out the vote that Black women have done that I think there's a real awareness of their centrality to democracy, but also to the Democratic Party. I also think that you take the fact that Kamala Harris is a very accomplished and well-qualified U.S. Senator, and the fact that she had a personal friendship with Joe Biden's late son, Hunter Biden, that all of those factors combined to make her what, looking backward, looks like a fairly obvious choice. And it was moving, I think, for many women to either see and hear her speech on Saturday evening, her acceptance speech, if you will, or to hear clips of it. It is an historic moment. It's 100 years since the 19th Amendment was ratified and 36 years since Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman to be placed as a VP candidate on a major party ticket. So history is being made.
Right. Yeah, and all along there too, you have the Voting Rights Act in 1964, that coming into play as well. Now, and I guess one other thing that is a little, and if you look at the map as it stands right now, and I know this is kind of a off the cuff sort of thing, but you look at the way that map is laid out, you have and even within the state of Ohio, any of the states almost, you have a urban versus rural sort of split in the votes. And I know we're generalizing, but there is something to that. So we've got just a couple of minutes here. That seems to be a pattern that's become locked in a little more than maybe we would have thought it would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Is that the case? Is that part of this new electorate structure that we have?
Yes, I think there's a real hardening of the urban and rural divide in this country that we saw manifested and we're continuing to see manifested as the votes are counted. I do think that unity is the message that the Biden campaign ran on. And now comes the biggest challenge for President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris is to deliver on that promise of unity. It will not be easy. About half of the country voted for somebody else, right? Not as many, right, as voted for the Biden-Harris ticket, but that will be a very difficult bridge. But in the first speech that he gave as the president-elect, Joe Biden put heavy emphasis on that message of unity and said that he will be the president for all Americans. I will be curious to see if he does things like put some Republicans in his cabinet, if he will really work with Senate Republicans, the Senate is likely to remain in Republican hands. So there are some very tangible things he can do to build bridges. And I think it's absolutely essential just for the healing of that chasm between urban and rural voters, who frankly, they have some commonalities in terms of some of the challenges they face. So I think there are things that can be done to bridge that divide.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there for right now. We'd like to think that this will be decided sooner rather than later, but we may be talking about this again in a few weeks as well. Dr. Melissa K. Miller, Bowling Green State University, thank you so much for your expertise and your insight into what happened on November 3rd and what has happened in the days since then, and what may happen in the subsequent days as we look at election 2020. You can check us out at WBGU.org. You can find us on social media as well. And of course, you can watch us every week here on WBGU PBS. We'll see you again next time on The Journal.